He wasn't supposed to survive. The wind howled through the trees like a banshee, swirling the snow into thick, blinding flurries. Sergeant Daniel Carter squinted through the icy storm, his breath catching in the frozen air. He had been in plenty of blizzards before, but this one felt different. The snowflakes were like tiny daggers, slicing through his skin, each step a battle against nature's fury. As he trudged forward, eyes scanning the snow-covered ground, his mind replayed the events that led him here, on this forsaken mountain pass in the middle of nowhere. The mission had been simple: deliver supplies to a remote outpost. But the storm had arrived without warning, and now, his jeep was stuck, wheels spinning uselessly in the thick snow. With no other choice, he had begun the long walk to find help. His fingers were numb, his body aching from the cold, but he kept moving. That was the Marine way. Move forward, no matter the odds. It was when he had nearly given up hope, his feet barely able to lift from the snow, that he saw it. A dark figure in the distance, barely visible against the white landscape. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind, but as he drew closer, he realized it was real. A German shepherd, lying half-buried in the snow, shivering uncontrollably. The dog's fur was matted with ice, its breath shallow and ragged, each exhale a puff of mist in the cold air. It was barely moving, its amber eyes looking up at him with a sense of resignation, as if it knew what was coming. Daniel's heart clenched. He was no stranger to death, but to see such a loyal creature in this state, it felt wrong. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees in the snow, his gloved hands shaking as he carefully pulled the dog from the freezing earth. The moment his arms wrapped around the dog's cold body, it let out a faint whimper, and Daniel swore he felt something inside him crack. He couldn't leave it here. He wouldn't. "Hang on, buddy," he muttered through gritted teeth, his voice hoarse from the cold. The dog's body was so cold, so lifeless, he wasn't sure if it could survive. But he wouldn't give up. He couldn't. With the dog cradled in his arms, Daniel stumbled back toward the jeep, each step a fight against the wind and snow. The storm was getting worse, but he wasn't about to let this dog die alone in the cold. As he made his way through the storm, the dog's head rested against his chest, and Daniel couldn't help but feel a strange connection. There was something in that dog's eyes, something that told him it wasn't ready to give up just yet. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to let this dog face it alone. What happened next would defy all odds, and neither Daniel nor the dog would ever be the same again. The wind howled louder as Daniel Carter struggled to hold the unconscious dog in his arms, the weight of both his body and the storm pressing down on him. Every step felt like he was wading through molasses, the snow thickening beneath his boots, the freezing air slicing through his jacket. The jeep was still stuck, its engine a silent testament to his failed attempt at getting out. But he wasn't giving up. Not now, not when the dog was still alive. Even if it seemed like an impossible feat, he stumbled forward, the dog's breath shallow against his chest. The weight in his arms felt heavier with every step, but Daniel didn't slow down. The dog's body was so cold it felt like he was carrying an ice block, but there was still something about it. A faint twitch, a breath of air that made him cling to the smallest bit of hope. He had seen enough battles, enough lives snuffed out in an instant, but this was different. This was not a soldier fighting a war. This was an animal. This was a dog, and it had been left to die in this hellish storm. He wasn't about to let that happen. Not on his watch. As he made his way through the thick snow, the storm seemed to ease just slightly, the winds dying down to a steady howl that felt like the very last breaths of the dying blizzard. He pressed on, his heart racing in his chest, though he couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from the adrenaline. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw it. His jeep, parked just ahead, just beyond the dark silhouette of the trees. He had made it. But, with the dog? He knelt down by the side of the jeep, gently placing the German shepherd on the snow. He quickly dug through his emergency pack, pulling out an old military blanket, wrapping it around the dog as best he could. He needed to keep it warm, keep it alive. The storm wasn't done yet. He couldn't let down his guard. As he worked, he spoke softly to the dog, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe he was trying to reassure himself as much as the dog. "You're gonna make it," he muttered under his breath. "You've gotta." The dog lay there, limp, its eyes closed, barely moving. Daniel checked its pulse again. Still there. Faint, but steady. A sign. A sign that it wasn't too late. He sighed in relief, then turned to the Jeep, trying to start the engine again, but it sputtered and died. "Come on," Daniel growled, slamming his fist against the dashboard. But just as he was about to give up, something caught his eye. The dog, the German Shepherd, was twitching, its eyes flickering open just enough to lock on him. Daniel froze. Hey buddy," he whispered, his voice soft with hope. "You with me?" The dog's amber eyes seemed to focus, just for a moment, and Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. He couldn't believe it. The dog was still with him. It wasn't dead yet. But what happened next would shake Daniel to his core. The German Shepherd, with all its strength, struggled to stand, its legs trembling, its body still too weak to support itself. And yet, somehow, it managed to crawl its way to the back of the Jeep. Daniel watched, confused, as the dog began to paw at something behind the vehicle. Something Daniel couldn't see at first. Then, the dog's bark broke the silence, sharp and urgent. It wasn't barking in fear, but in desperation. The dog wanted him to follow. Reluctantly, Daniel stood up, wiping the snow from his hands. He wasn't sure what the dog was trying to tell him, but there was something in its eyes, something that screamed at him to follow. With cautious steps, Daniel made his way around the Jeep. And that's when he saw it. Buried beneath a small mound of snow, partially hidden behind a cluster of fallen branches, was a figure. A person. A human. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed over, fear gripping him. What he uncovered, what he found beneath the snow, would change everything. And just like that, the storm outside felt less important. The struggle for survival had just taken a drastic turn. The moment Daniel uncovered the figure beneath the snow, his heart raced. The storm had swallowed everything, leaving only the faintest outlines of the world around him. The figure was small, barely visible through the heavy layers of snow and branches, and for a moment, Daniel wondered if he was imagining things. But then the dog, the German Shepherd, barked again, louder this time, more insistent. The dog had found something, and Daniel could feel it deep in his bones. The moment was urgent. He reached down, his gloved hands trembling, and began clearing the snow away. With each scoop, his thoughts raced. Who could be out here in this kind of storm? What were the chances? The more snow he cleared, the more he could make out the details. A man, slumped against the tree, his face pale and frozen, his eyes closed as if in a deep, unrelenting sleep. The man was wearing a military jacket, just like Daniel's. A Marine, just like him. Panic surged through Daniel's chest. The man could be another soldier stranded in the storm, someone who had been out here for hours, maybe longer. He didn't have time to waste. The urgency of the situation hit him like a wave. With a steady hand, Daniel gently lifted the Marine's head. There was a faint pulse, but it was weak. Too weak. The storm was still howling around them, but Daniel knew that if he didn't act fast, it would be too late. He quickly checked the man's body for signs of injury, but found none. He didn't have the luxury of time to figure it all out. With no hesitation, Daniel slid his arms beneath the Marine's body and, with all his strength, lifted him. The cold air bit at his face, but Daniel didn't notice. He was focused only on getting the man to safety. Behind him, the dog, Atlas, stayed close, its amber eyes focused on him as if guiding him forward. Together, they trudged through the deep snow, Daniel carrying the Marine in his arms, the dog leading the way with its unflinching loyalty. The Jeep was only a few yards away now, but every step felt like an eternity. The wind was picking up again, howling through the trees, and the snow seemed to fall even harder. But Daniel didn't stop. He couldn't. The dog barked once, breaking through the roar of the storm, and Daniel followed its lead. They reached the Jeep, and with one final burst of energy, Daniel managed to open the door and lay the Marine inside. His heart raced in his chest as he made sure the man was secure, wrapping him in the blanket he had brought for the dog. Atlas sat by the door, its eyes never leaving him, as if waiting for the next step. "You did it," Daniel muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "You found him." The storm outside raged on, but inside the Jeep, for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a flicker of hope. Daniel turned to the dog, his chest tightening with gratitude. "You're not just a dog, are you?" he whispered. The dog's ears perked up, and it let out a low bark, as if acknowledging the compliment. Daniel smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. Atlas had led him here, to this moment, and in doing so, had given both men a second chance. As the storm continued to rage, Daniel knew they had made it through the worst of it. The rest would be up to him. But as he looked at the German shepherd sitting calmly beside him, he realized that sometimes, even in the darkest of storms, loyalty and trust could be the greatest miracle of all. The storm had subsided slightly by the time Daniel sat in the Jeep, Atlas still by his side. The temperature inside the vehicle was bitter, but it was nothing compared to the cold outside. The Marine lay slumped in the passenger seat, still unconscious, but his chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. Daniel's fingers hovered over the radio, but there was nothing. The radio had been dead for hours, and his phone, as always, had no signal. They were isolated, alone in the mountains, miles away from any real help. The storm had torn through the mountain pass, leaving destruction in its wake. It had torn apart the roads, buried the trails, and even now, Daniel wasn't sure if it was safe to move. But he couldn't stay here. Not with a man lying half dead beside him and a dog that had already shown him what real loyalty was. Atlas shifted in the back seat, letting out a low growl. Daniel turned to the dog, surprised by the noise. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. Atlas's amber eyes locked on his, and the dog gave a sharp bark. It was as if the dog was trying to tell him something important. For a second, Daniel considered just waiting out the storm, but something in the dog's gaze told him not to. The silence in the Jeep was broken only by the sound of the wind, but even that seemed distant. The urgency had faded. There was only the waiting, the isolation, and the constant feeling that time was slipping away. Daniel's eyes drifted to the Marine, the man who had been buried in the snow, the one Atlas had found. He had no idea who this man was or why he was out here, but Daniel didn't have the luxury of asking questions. The dog had led him here, and now it was up to him to make sure they both survived. The wind howled once more, but this time Daniel wasn't listening to the storm. He was listening to the quiet call of responsibility, of survival, of the obligation he felt to this Marine and to the dog. Atlas had saved him once already. It was time for Daniel to return the favor. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life with a low rumble. He didn't have much fuel, and he wasn't sure how far they could go, but he couldn't sit here, helpless. The moment they started moving, Atlas stood up in the back seat, his eyes sharp, alert, ready. The dog wasn't giving up, not even now. Daniel adjusted his grip on the wheel and pushed the Jeep forward. The tires struggled at first, but they eventually found traction. The snow was still thick in some places, but the Jeep was making progress. The road ahead was unclear, but there was no turning back. They had to move forward. Every bump and dip in the snow felt like a new challenge, but Daniel didn't care. The man beside him needed help, and the dog was his guide. For once, the storm didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like the last hurdle between them and survival. As the Jeep rumbled through the snow-covered road, Daniel looked out the windshield, Atlas's gaze never leaving him. The dog had found him once, and now, it was Daniel's turn to find their way out. He didn't know how long it would take, or if they would make it, but one thing was certain. He wasn't giving up on them. Not now. Not ever. And with that thought, Daniel pushed the accelerator harder, letting the storm rage around them, knowing that survival wasn't just about getting through the storm. It was about finding your way, no matter how hard it was to see. The Jeep slowly crept through the deep snow, the engine sputtering as it struggled to gain traction. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white from the cold and the stress. He was exhausted, but there was no room for weakness now. The road ahead was barely visible, the storm continuing to swirl around them like an endless wall of snow. Atlas, still alert in the back seat, kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The dog had been a constant presence since the moment they met, its unwavering loyalty a beacon in the darkness. Daniel glanced at the Marine beside him, still unconscious, his face pale and his body trembling from the cold. Despite the thick blankets Daniel had wrapped him in, the man's condition was still critical. Every minute that passed without proper medical attention felt like a countdown. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. The storm wasn't letting up, and Daniel knew the longer they stayed in it, the greater the chances of everything going wrong. The Jeep lurched again, the tires slipping over a patch of ice. Daniel cursed under his breath, but kept his focus, steering carefully as the vehicle bounced over uneven terrain. Every so often, Atlas would let out a low growl, as if trying to warn him of something ahead, and Daniel would slow down, scanning the area. It wasn't much longer before the trees began to thin out, and Daniel spotted something through the flurry of snow. A light. A dim glow through the storm, like a promise of warmth, a sign of life in the middle of all this isolation. Without hesitation, he aimed the Jeep toward the light, his heart picking up speed. As he drove closer, the shape of a small cabin became clear. It was old and weathered, the paint chipped and the windows dark, but it was standing, and that was enough. They had found shelter. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he pulled the Jeep to a stop outside the cabin. The wind had died down a little, but the cold was still biting, and the snow had started to settle into a thick blanket around them. He quickly shut off the engine and looked at Atlas. "Stay," he said, his voice rough from the cold and exhaustion. The dog looked back at him, then gave a small bark, as if acknowledging the command. Daniel carefully opened the door and slid out, wincing as his boots sank into the snow. He moved to the passenger side and opened the door to check on the Marine. The man was still breathing, but barely. Daniel could feel the heat of panic rising in his chest. He needed to get him inside, get him warm. He carefully lifted the Marine's limp body into his arms, wincing at the coldness of the man's skin. As he carried him toward the cabin, he could hear the crunch of the snow beneath his boots, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. The door to the cabin creaked as Daniel pushed it open with his shoulder. The interior was dimly lit, a faint light flickering from a small kerosene lamp on a table near the hearth. It was small, cozy, with a fire already burning low in the stone fireplace. The warmth inside was a welcome relief from the brutal cold outside. He set the Marine down on the nearest chair, quickly unwrapping the blankets from his body and starting a fire with what little wood was left in the cabin. Atlas sat by the door, watching Daniel intently, as if waiting for further instructions. The room was quiet except for the crackling of the fire, but Daniel couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he worked. He didn't know if the Marine would wake up, didn't know if he would survive this night, but he had to try. He had to believe that there was still hope. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, Daniel finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. Atlas, ever watchful, lay down. Beside the door, its amber eyes never leaving Daniel as he worked. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, but for the first time in hours, there was a sense of calm. They had made it through the worst of the storm. Now, they just had to wait and hope that the warmth of the fire would bring the Marine back from the edge. Hours passed in the small, dimly lit cabin. The storm outside seemed to have finally reached its peak, the wind howling like an angry beast. Inside, the warmth from the fire was a blessing, but the stillness in the room weighed heavily on Daniel. He kept glancing at the Marine, his eyes fixed on the man's still form in the chair. His breathing was shallow, slow, like a flicker of light barely holding on. Daniel couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of time passing, the minutes slipping away as he waited, hoping for something. Anything. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with an almost soothing rhythm, but Daniel's mind was a whirlwind. He had seen countless things in his time as a Marine, but this felt different. This was personal. The dog, Atlas, had found the Marine, and now it was up to Daniel to keep him alive. He moved to the fire and stoked the embers, trying to bring a little more heat to the room. He needed to keep the man warm. He had to. After a moment, he took a deep breath and turned back to the Marine. His eyes were still closed, and his skin was still cold to the touch. But there was something about him, something in the way he sat there, that made Daniel feel like he wasn't entirely gone. Atlas, as always, was watching from the corner, its amber eyes never leaving the man. It was as if the dog understood the gravity of the situation. It seemed to sense the urgency, the need to keep fighting. Daniel looked at the dog for a moment, then back at the Marine. He wasn't going to let him die here, not like this. He wasn't going to leave anyone behind. "Hang in there," Daniel whispered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if anyone was listening. The room was quiet, save for the sound of the fire and the occasional shift of Atlas's position. Daniel sat down beside the Marine, his body aching with fatigue, but his mind still sharp. He reached out, carefully checking the Marine's pulse again, his fingers lightly pressing against the man's wrist. The pulse was faint, but it was there. That was all that mattered right now. Daniel's mind raced, calculating, thinking. He had a first aid kit in the Jeep, but there wasn't much he could do without the proper supplies. Still, he couldn't just sit here and wait for the storm to take him. The Marine had been through too much already. Daniel stood up, his legs stiff from sitting too long, and went to the door. He opened it just enough to let the wind gust in, and as the snow continued to fall, he could see the outline of the Jeep parked not far away. He wasn't sure if it would even start, but he had to try. He grabbed his jacket and wrapped it around himself, then turned to Atlas. "Stay here," he said quietly. The dog gave a low bark, acknowledging the command. Daniel made his way outside, the snow immediately biting at his face, but he didn't hesitate. The Jeep was stuck, buried beneath a thick layer of snow, but the engine still hummed faintly as he approached. He turned the key, praying for a miracle. The engine sputtered and then roared to life, a small victory in the midst of the storm. Daniel quickly grabbed the first aid kit from the back, hoping he could find something useful to help the Marine. With the kit in hand, he returned to the cabin, breathing heavily from the cold and the effort. He closed the door behind him, blocking out the howling wind, and set the kit on the table. Atlas stood up, walking over to him, its eyes alert, watching every move. Daniel quickly examined the contents of the kit: bandages, antiseptic, pain relievers. Not much, but it was a start. He moved back to the Marine, his hands steady as he worked to clean the man's face, wiping away the dirt and snow. The warmth of the cabin felt good, but the man needed more than that. Daniel could see that now. He needed care, and he needed it fast. As he worked, Atlas sat by the fire, its gaze unwavering. The storm outside continued, but inside the cabin, there was a flicker of hope. Daniel wasn't sure if they could make it through the night, but with every passing moment, he was more certain of one thing. He wasn't going to give up. Not on the Marine, not on Atlas, and not on himself. The storm outside was fierce, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the unspoken bond between man and dog gave him the strength to keep going. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the cabin, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands still trembling from the constant worry. The storm outside had been relentless, but inside, it felt like a fragile pocket of safety. The Marine had finally stabilized, his breathing now even and steady, but the relief was short-lived. Daniel knew they weren't out of the woods yet. His eyes flickered between the unconscious man and Atlas, who lay at his feet, its eyes watching every movement Daniel made. The dog had been remarkably calm throughout the entire ordeal, its loyalty never wavering for a second. Atlas had always been more than a pet, more than just a companion. It was a partner, a friend, and in this moment, Daniel felt that bond stronger than ever. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the exhaustion that was creeping in. He had to stay alert, stay focused. The Marine needed care, and he had no idea how long they would be stuck here, trapped by the storm. Daniel glanced at the small window beside the door, where the snow continued to fall in thick, swirling gusts. The storm was still furious, but the light had changed. Dawn was breaking, though the world outside remained hidden behind a veil of white. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. There was nothing but the crackle of the fire, the steady breath of the Marine, and the silent, watchful presence of Atlas. Daniel reached over to check the Marine again, making sure the warmth from the fire had not caused any issues. His skin was still pale, but the color was slowly returning, the frostbite from the storm receding. It wasn't much, but it was progress. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The man was still alive, and that was something Daniel could work with. As he leaned back against the wall, rubbing his tired eyes, he thought about the moment when they had found the Marine. How Atlas had led him to that hidden figure in the snow, pulling Daniel from his own sense of helplessness and into action. The bond between them, man and dog, was something Daniel could never have imagined. It was unspoken, instinctive, and undeniable. Atlas had saved them both. The storm outside howled again, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It was just noise, background to the real struggle taking place inside. Daniel's mind kept racing. How long could they stay here? What if the storm didn't let up for days? What if they ran out of supplies? He knew he couldn't let himself be consumed by fear. Not now. The Marine's steady pulse gave him something to hold on to, something to fight for. He wasn't going to let this man die in the middle of nowhere. He wasn't going to fail Atlas, or himself. He stood up, stretching his stiff legs, and checked on the supplies in the cabin again. The food was limited, and they were already low on water. But there was still enough to get them through another day, maybe more. He turned to look at the Marine again. The man was still unconscious, his face pale, but no longer as drawn. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Atlas raised its head and gave a soft bark, snapping Daniel out of his thoughts. The dog's amber eyes locked onto his with an intensity that was hard to ignore. Daniel nodded. "We'll be all right," he muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was reassuring. He moved over to the table, grabbed the first aid kit again, and began to prepare for what might come next. The storm could last for hours, maybe even days, but there was still a chance. They were still breathing, still alive, and as long as there was hope, Daniel wouldn't give up. He couldn't. Not when Atlas was by his side. Not when the Marine was counting on him. The fire crackled louder now, a beacon of warmth in the otherwise silent cabin. Atlas stood, its eyes never leaving Daniel as it moved to sit closer to the Marine. For a brief moment, Daniel allowed himself to believe that, despite everything, they were going to make it through this. The storm outside couldn't stop them. Not as long as they had each other. The hours dragged on, the storm outside showing no signs of letting up. The fire in the cabin burned low, casting long shadows on the walls, but it was enough to keep the cold at bay, for now. Daniel sat by the fire, his legs aching from the strain of the last few days. He had checked on the Marine again, still no change. The man's breathing had remained steady, but he was still unconscious, his skin pale and cold to the touch. Daniel couldn't afford to rest, not yet. Atlas, ever watchful, sat by the door, its amber eyes flicking between Daniel and the Marine, as if keeping guard. The dog's silent loyalty was a comfort, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. Daniel stood up and stretched, his muscles stiff from sitting too long. He moved over to the window and peered out into the snowstorm. The landscape was a blur of white, and the visibility was nearly zero. He couldn't see beyond the small patch of ground in front of the cabin. The world outside had disappeared, swallowed by the storm. But inside, there was warmth. Inside, there was hope. He glanced back at the Marine, then over at Atlas. They were all in this together, bound by the same struggle for survival. He wasn't going to let them down. The night wore on, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional shifting of Atlas's position. Daniel went back to checking the first aid kit, making sure everything was ready in case the Marine woke up. He hadn't been able to do much in terms of real medical care, but he had done what he could with the limited supplies. The man needed more than just warmth and rest. He needed proper medical attention, but there was no way to get him that. Not out here, not in the middle of a blizzard. Daniel sighed heavily. It was a strange feeling, being trapped in the storm, surrounded by nothing but snow and silence. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much this situation had changed him. He wasn't just a Marine anymore. He was a man who had found himself in a fight for survival, one that didn't involve guns or missions, but the simple, raw need to keep going. To live. He had already done the impossible by getting the Marine to safety. Now he had to wait. The fire flickered again, and Daniel glanced up. Atlas had moved closer to the Marine, its nose gently nudging the man's hand. The dog seemed to know something Daniel didn't. It was as if Atlas understood the delicate balance between life and death, and was determined to keep fighting, no matter what. Daniel walked over and knelt down beside the dog. "You've done your part," he whispered, though he knew the dog wasn't looking for praise. Atlas didn't need words. It had already given everything. Just as Daniel was about to stand up, the Marine's chest rose and fell more rapidly, a sign of movement, of life. His eyelids fluttered. Daniel froze, heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he didn't breathe. Then the Marine's eyes slowly opened, unfocused at first, and Daniel leaned closer. "Hey," Daniel said softly, his voice hoarse. "You're safe now." The Marine's eyes blinked, slowly focusing on Daniel's face. There was confusion, disorientation, but also something else, recognition. The man's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a whisper, he spoke. Where am I?" Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The Marine was awake. "You're safe," Daniel repeated, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're in a cabin. The storm's still out there, but you're okay now." The Marine blinked again, his body sagging in relief. Thank you," he whispered. "You saved me." Daniel nodded. still processing the reality of what had just happened. The man was alive. Against all odds, they had made it through the worst of it. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a quiet sense of victory settled over them. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself to believe that survival wasn't just a matter of chance. It was something earned, something that could be fought for. Atlas sat by the fire, its head resting on its paws, watching the two men. The dog's presence, its unwavering loyalty, was the final piece of the puzzle. They had survived, and they would keep going. Together. The room was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the fire and the rhythmic sound of the wind outside, still howling like a distant beast. Daniel sat by the fire, watching the Marine as he slowly regained his strength. His face was still pale, but the color was returning to his cheeks. His eyes, though tired, were focused, and there was a flicker of recognition when he looked at Daniel. Atlas, as always, lay nearby, its amber eyes locked on the two men, ever vigilant. Daniel had never seen a dog like this. The loyalty, the instinct, there was something almost otherworldly about it. The storm had claimed so much from them, but in this small cabin, with the fire keeping the cold at bay, they were surviving. The Marine shifted in his seat, his voice hoarse but gaining strength. How long? How long was I out? He asked, his eyes still trying to adjust to his surroundings. Daniel looked at him, his heart a little lighter now that he could see the man was waking up. A couple of days, Daniel replied, his voice calm but thick with the weight of everything they had been through. The storm kept us here longer than expected, but you're safe now. The Marine nodded slowly, processing the information. He looked around the room, his gaze falling on the flickering fire, then back to Daniel. I don't know how to thank you, he said quietly. You saved my life. Daniel smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his tired eyes. You don't need to thank me, he replied. We both made it through. That's enough for me. The Marine shifted again, his hand moving to the edge of the chair as he tried to push himself up. Daniel quickly moved to help, his instincts kicking in to offer support. Easy there, Daniel said gently, his hand resting on the Marine's shoulder. Take it slow. You're still recovering. The Marine nodded again, sinking back into the chair. He looked at Atlas, who was still sitting by the fire, watching them both. That dog, the Marine said, his voice filled with awe. He saved me, didn't he? Daniel's eyes softened as he looked at the dog. He did more than that. He found you when we didn't have a clue where to look. Atlas has been with me through a lot, and he's never let me down. The Marine's gaze followed Daniel's, and for a moment, the two men shared a silent understanding. There was something deep in that moment, something unspoken, that connected them all. The storm outside continued its rage, but inside the cabin, there was a peace that had been hard-earned. Daniel could feel the weariness in his bones, but he also felt a quiet sense of victory. They had made it. The storm, the isolation, the fear, none of it had broken them. They had survived. And that, he realized, was enough. The Marine looked back at him, his expression steady now, but there was something else in his eyes, gratitude, but also something deeper. I don't know where I would be without you and that dog, he said, his voice softer this time. But I know one thing. I won't forget this. Daniel nodded, his own thoughts running parallel. He wasn't sure what the future held, but right now, in this small cabin, with the fire crackling and the storm raging outside, they had something far more important than survival. They had each other. Atlas rose from its spot near the fire and padded over to the Marine, its eyes soft as it nudged the man's hand with its nose. The Marine smiled faintly and reached out, his fingers brushing the dog's fur. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The bond between them was forged in that moment, just like the bond between Daniel and Atlas. In the face of the storm, in the face of everything that had tried to tear them apart, they had found each other. And for the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself to truly relax. The road ahead wasn't clear, and the storm was far from over, but in this moment, they had won. They had made it. Together. In this heartwarming tale of survival, two unlikely companions, a man and his dog, faced the brutal forces of nature, showing the power of loyalty and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The man, stranded in a blizzard, finds hope when his loyal dog discovers a Marine trapped in the snow, unconscious and close to death. As the storm rages on, the man, aided by his devoted dog, works tirelessly to keep the Marine alive, showing that true courage comes from fighting for others, even in the harshest conditions. Through the bond between them, the story highlights how even in the most difficult circumstances, a dog's instinct and a man's resilience can make the impossible possible. As the days pass, the man and his dog continue to fight against the elements, proving that survival is not just about enduring the storm, but about helping each other through it. This is more than just an animal story. It's a testament to the power of hope and the unspoken connection between a human and an animal. From finding the Marine to keeping him alive, this animal story reminds us that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the quiet moments of survival. As the storm subsides and the Marine regains consciousness, he looks at his rescuers, forever grateful for the bond formed in the middle of a storm. Their struggle is a perfect example of what makes animal stories so compelling: loyalty, love, and survival in the face of nature's wrath. This animal story continues to inspire as the bond between the man and his dog proves that no storm is too great when you have each other by your side. Character 1 is a Caucasian man, approximately 30 to 35 years old, wearing a rugged military jacket and a beanie. His face is weathered from exposure, with short dark hair and a few days stubble. His expression is determined, focused, and calm. The scene is a close-up, frontal shot with natural lighting, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.